Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with Romana Software and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Managing User Stories for Effective Development and Testing with Romana by Dr. Magdi Hanna. We're excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is sponsored by Romana Software, the leader in application lifecycle management technology. For more information on how Romana Software can help you or your organization, please visit romanasoftware.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Acceptance Criteria versus Scenarios, Writing Better User Stories with Romana ALM by Dr. Magdi Hanna on June 1st from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to romanasoftware.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at romanasoftware.com. You'll be asked to complete a short survey at the end of today's webinar. At Romana Software, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Magdi Hanna. Dr. Hanna?
Thank you, Eric. All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to be with me for this 1 hour or so. As we always promise, our free webinars are always educational, so I'm going to spend some time with you today to talk about user stories and how we can effectively manage user stories. So my name is Magdi Hanna. I am the CEO and also Chief Technology Officer of Romana Software. I'm the one who architected the product, so I'm very familiar with all the features in the product. But let's forget about the product for now and talk about user stories. I have some facts for you here about user stories. But before I do that, may I ask, please, out of the people who are attending with me today, how many of you are currently working on projects that's using user stories? Please go ahead and raise your hand if you work on a project that uses user stories, or you did in the past. Go ahead. Don't see any hands yet. Okay, few, 3 so far, 4. All right. Not everyone worked with the user stories. I'm going to at least assume that everyone knows what user stories are. If not, I'll just give a quick example. Carl and Char have not worked with user stories before. Again, I will repeat the question one last time. If you have been working in any project that uses user stories, please raise your hand. And of course, I'm implying that your project is Agile project. But however, some Agile projects are not necessarily using user stories. All right, not everyone is using user stories. Well, it will become obvious what they are and so on. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with me here. All right, so here are some facts about user stories. If you have not seen them before, they are very brief and high level. The people who advocate Agile and advocate user stories wanted us not to work with requirements because requirements seems to be lengthy and complex, so they wanted to simplify issues for us. And they said, we're not going to deal with requirements, rather we're going to break requirements to user stories. You'll see an example of a user story for now in a little bit if you have not seen one before. User stories, when you see them, they do not provide context. If the user story is a very, very high level, then they are the context. If the user story is a very low level, for example, okay, let me show you an example of a user story here. This is what I consider a very high level user story. In user story terminology, we call it an epic, which is supposed to be broken down into smaller and smaller user stories. By the way, but if I say anything that it does not make any sense to you, or you have a question about it, please feel free to go ahead and submit your question in writing on the questions tab, and I will address it at the end of the presentation. So this user story, as you can see it, is high level, is very brief, is high level, and it does provide context because it is the highest level. So the context here is someone wants to cancel orders online. However, if we take that user story and break it down into smaller user stories, and you see another user story which says, as a customer, I'd like to receive my refund on the same credit card that I used for payment. Now, in that case, that user story, if you take it by itself, does not provide context, meaning that you do not know what refund we're talking about and what credit card we're talking about. Now, most importantly, in my opinion, user stories are very difficult to estimate how much time we need in order to implement it. In agile projects, we estimate the effort for a user story using what we call story points. So I have seen agile teams assigning story points to user stories. And I'm going to tell you this, at best, it is very, very subjective. Why? Because the user story as it is written now does not provide a lot of details. You don't know how many screens it's going to involve. You don't know the details. So user stories really did not help us, in my opinion at least, did not help us in understanding customer needs better. Let me tell you a little bit more things about user stories. User stories are always phrased in the form that you've seen as a whatever role I have, in this case it's a customer, I'd like to be able to do something. Okay, as a customer or as an admin, as a user, I want to be able to do something. Well, guess what? We all know that not everything the system does involves the user. And as I always say, we have those functions that the system will perform without the user being involved. I mean, take the simplest, for example, is that the system will calculate a penalty or a stocking fee on canceled orders that's equal to 20% of the order value. The system will calculate a stocking fee or restocking fee which is 20% of the value of the order. Well, the user does not have anything to do with this. And how am I going to phrase this as user story? I am not sure. And people who use user story, they go around it and says, oh, we can tweak it. We say, as a customer, I would like to see the system calculating the restocking fee. I don't like that. If this was to be phrased as a requirement, we would state it explicitly as a requirement, would say system shall calculate a restocking fee as 20% of the total order, and we're done. And there is no reason to be artificial and say, as a user, I'd like to see the system calculating. All right, please, if you object to anything I say or you have an opinion, share it with me, because that's very important here. Don't believe everything I say. Don't agree with everything I say. As I always teach people when I teach requirements and when I teach testing in general, I say you've got to pay attention to what I call shall not do. I refer to them sometimes as negative requirements. We get very busy trying to make sure that the system does what it's supposed to do, but we pay very little attention to make sure that the system does not do anything that it is not supposed to do. And that is what negative testing is all about. And if I am going to look at a user story, that always tells me that as a user, I want to do this. As a user, I wanted to do this. You'll find that those user stories are always stated in the positive way, in the things that I shall be able to do, or the things that the system shall be able to perform for me. I don't see user stories that says, as a user, I'd like to see the system not doing this. Or as a user, I want to make sure I do not want to do this. You see that? And don't get me wrong. I am not saying requirements are any better than user stories with that aspect. Because most requirements are also stated in the form of system shall do this. Customer shall be able to do this. And we forget completely about the shall not do's. Please, if there is anything you can get out of this slide, it is the shall not do's behavior that you have to focus on when you are analyzing the user story, when you're analyzing a requirement, and when you're designing your tests. And at the same time, if you're a developer, when you are writing the code. Okay, so that's a general problem here. Of course, we all know that our requirements about a system is not all functional. Let's be clear about this. User stories, the way they were invented and the way they are practiced, are all functional. They are all about things the system will do, or the things that I as a user would like to do. We all know that there are a bunch of quality requirements which might have to do with security and safety and reliability and ease of use and all that stuff that are not easy to be stated in the form of a user story. And I talk to people sometimes. I says, how would you represent or express a quality requirement in a user story? And I get different opinions. Someone says, we leave them alone. Someone says, we put them as requirements. And someone say, oh, we still do them as a user story, but we tweak the format a little bit. Okay. I am not trying to criticize, well, maybe I am. I am trying to show you the limitations of user stories. In fact, the title of this slide was Limitations of User Stories. And I did not want to come across as so negative, so I changed this title just last night. All right? So, but I want to do this. And the other requirements I'm referring to, which are implementation constraints. There are some requirements that has to do with how the system will implement it. And I don't want to get into this because some of you will argue that if it is how, then it's not a requirement, it is design. This is a different discussion. There are some requirements that states some implementation constraints that are requirements and they're not designed. And even if they are designed, they are something that someone expected the system to satisfy. You know, there's a lot of things about design, about how the system will be implemented that are actually requirements. So in general, I'm just presenting to you few issues with user stories so that when you use them, you can be aware of that. So as a result, I'm asking you, if you are a test professional working with user stories, please do not ever take a user story and build some test design based on that. And if you are a developer, don't take a user story and build a design or code based on this. This does not work. It has not proven to work. So what am I suggesting at this point? Well, we need to do something about user stories to make it complete, testable, precise, and all the good stuff we know about requirements, okay, in order to be able to use a user story for testing. So in my opinion, many of us working on Agile projects, we treat user stories in a very simplistic way. It's a one statement or one phrase that says, as a role, I want to be able to do something. And I found out that it's not as simple as what we think. User stories, you might find different developers working with different user stories. You might find different testers working with different user stories. But the truth is, we're not aware of how user stories relate to each other, and we're not aware of the level of complexity of a user story. Not the apparent level of complexity, because we simplify user stories, we make it look like it is simple. But the truth is, it is not simple. And let me show you a few things. If you really must use user stories in a project, I make it very clear. You must use best practices in user story management. User story management, a term we do not hear very often. Why? Because in everyone's opinion, user stories are simple. So what management are we talking about? People don't think that there is anything about user stories that we need to manage. Why? Because they're simple. If you have very simple things, you don't need to manage them. But because I'm telling you that user stories are not as simple as we think, I'm going to introduce to you the field of user story management. For so many years, we have worked with requirements. And the field of requirement management and requirement engineering has been well defined, okay? And people follow the principles and the practices of requirement engineering and requirement management. Somehow, when we started to use user stories, and I'm really blaming those who advocate user stories as a simplistic approach, all right? Somehow, when we started to use user stories, that whole thing, that whole field and whole practice of requirements management has completely disappeared. And we lied to ourselves. And we said, we don't need to do requirement management anymore because we're using the user stories, which are much simpler than requirement management. I will share with you my own 12 best practices in user story management. If you must use user stories in a project, I want you to look at those 12 best practices, which I came up with based on my many years of experience dealing with requirements, many years of experience using with user stories, and I decided to put together the practices that we must have when we deal with the user stories. If you have been using user stories, you've been dealing with them, you will get a good understanding of what I'm talking about. If you have not seen user stories before, I think those practices are written in a very simple way. Let me tell you the first one, absolutely. User stories exist in a hierarchy of details. I'm totally opposing to the idea that user stories are a flat list of things. When we deal with a sprint in an agile project, some people say, okay, here are the 5 user stories that we're going to deal with. And those 5 user stories are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, guess what? It is not like that. When user stories exist in the product backlog, we don't have 300 user stories that are listed as a flat list. Well, of course, in fact, we do. And here I'm saying we should never list user stories as a flat list. Why? Because user stories are not much different in requirements in the sense that they come on a higher level. So like this one, for example, that you saw in the previous slide, as a customer, I want to be able to cancel my order online. That's a very high level user story. I should be allowed in whatever tool I am using or whatever documentation package, whether it is Microsoft Word or some user story management tool, Jira or otherwise, I must be allowed to say, here is a high-level user story, here are sub-user stories, and here is sub-user stories, and I will show you this in a little bit. So that's very important. If we don't do this, then I'm going to tell you that user stories are going to not provide any context, because you're going to have a small user story that says, as a customer, I want to receive my refund on the credit card. And you take that user story by itself, you don't know what is related to. But you will understand the context if that user story is a sub-user story of another user story. Okay? So that's the first practice. If I have anyone in the webinar today who consider himself or herself a user story guru, please argue that with me. I will be publishing this on LinkedIn very soon. And if you'd like, if you need more space to argue any one of those points, please feel free to go in LinkedIn and get that and let's discuss it there, because that's very important. It's very important that you give me your opinion, we challenge things, and we reach an agreement. The next practice, absolutely. We know user stories change over time. We just close our eyes about that. And some people say, when a user story change, we create another user story. Really? I have not seen that's possible. Because here's the thing. If a user story remain to be, excuse me. If a user story remain to be simple, then someone might argue that it will not change. As a customer, I'd like to be able to cancel my order online. Well, what is going to change in that user story? Nothing. Nothing. Because it is a user story. It is user story that's high level, and we want it implemented as is. But then other user stories, the lower level ones may change. Because if I have a sub-user story that says, as a customer, I'd like to receive the refund to the credit card I used for payment. Later on, someone says, well, we want to allow customer to receive the refund as a store credit, for example. And some people say, oh, at that time, we will create another user story that says, as a customer, I'd like to receive the refund as a store credit. But that user story is standalone. It's out of context completely. We should not be dealing with it by itself. We need to be dealing with it as part of the larger user story. So it is my experience that when user story changes, I don't want to create another user story, but I want to create a version, another version of users. When anything changes in our life, we create another version. Why are we stopping this when it comes to user story? When things change in our life, we keep track of the history of the change. If there is any details about a user story that have changed over time, don't you want to know what has changed about the user story, and when, and who suggested the change, and why, and most importantly, what is the impact of that change on other user stories? This is the classical stuff about change management, which we have learned for years, and somehow we suppressed all that when it comes to user story. I refuse to use user stories if I don't have a way to keep track of history. When a user story gets changed, when someone suggests that a user story must change, then they need to submit a request. Someone now right away, someone from the Agile community is going to say, oh, change request, you're taking us back to the waterfall model. Absolutely not. Who said when we started dealing with Agile, the concept of a change request does not exist? Even the Agile manifesto states that customer will change their mind and will try to accommodate our customers. Well, great. When the customer changes their mind, how are we going to document that change? Are we going to allow the customer to make a telephone call and say, I'm changing my mind? Are we going to allow the customer to send an email and says, no, I don't want the user story to be this way, but this way? No. A change request. You can call it whatever you want. I use the phrase, the term change request, because this is a very commonly known term. But you can call it anything you want, but there has to be a request for the change. If you've been in software for years, you know that this is the case. And you know that we've been ignoring some formalities. The Agile framework, in the interest of simplification, has ignored a lot of the best practices and a lot of discipline, and we started to have a sloppy process. And let me tell you this, sloppy process will only give you a sloppy product. If you want a good product, you must have a process, and the process can be Agile. It doesn't have to be a waterfall model. Okay, user stories must be collaboratively reviewed and possibly approved. How many of you work in Agile projects that says we approved the user stories? Now, I work closely with some of the companies in the biomedical industry. And I know what it means for a requirement or a user story to be approved. In fact, the FDA and the ISO standards would not approve your product if you do not have a way in your requirement management / user story management to approve the requirement or the user story by certain people within the organization. So if you're going to work on a little bit rigorous environment, and now everyone is talking about scaling Agile. Are we going to scale Agile to work in aviation systems, in military, in medical devices with a sloppy process? No, it is not going to work. We have to have a way to approve user stories. I'll show you all that. I know some of you might say, well, it's easy for you to speak, but where are the evidence? I'll show you exactly. And I know you might think that I am selling the tool, the Romana ALM to you, but guess what? I am showing you, I'll be showing you that Romana ALM does all these 12 practices to the book. And it does them, and no other user story management tool does that. In fact, I should not be even using the term user story management, because there is no user story management out there. There are user story tools. There's no user story tool out there that does these. And I'm giving you this list not because I want you to buy Romana ALM, but I want you to use them as a yardstick to measure those other tools you're using, if you are using ones. And if you decide to acquire a tool, you've got to make sure that the tool supports those best practices, or at the very least, it should support those the ones you believe apply to your project or the ones you care for. So maybe you're going to read my 12 best practices and say, oh, Magdi's out of his mind. I don't think that's important. But at least you're going to find 3 or 4 or 5 of those are very important. If you find none of this is very important, then I suggest that you don't use Agile, don't use user stories. Is it a secret that user stories relate to others? Absolutely. I mean, a user story must be implemented before another user story. That's interdependencies between user stories. A user story must be tested along with another user story. A user story has some details that will help the other user story. So there is always a relationship between user stories. That's a given. And when you do user story management, you have to watch for that. And you have to be able to document relationships between user stories. Now, once I start to talk about use cases, people are going to say, you're confusing things. User stories are different from use cases. Absolutely. Of course. Use cases existed for years. And somehow, when we started to use user stories, we abandoned use cases. Although those of us who use the use cases know how powerful they are in expressing things that user stories will never do, and requirements will never do. Use cases are very powerful in showing the interactions between the pieces of the system and between the system and the other systems. So in this user story that I have, that says, as a customer, I want to be able to cancel my order online. I am suggesting that if I want to understand how this user story will work, I might very well associate a use case, build a use case to show the interaction between the customer and the system, and between the system and the accounting system, because the refund is going to be issued, and between the system and the inventory system and whatever other systems are. We all know that no system performs a function on its own. All systems collaborate with other systems to perform functions. And as a result, we need to express and define this collaboration. And user stories completely lack the ability to express interactions between systems and subsystems. It's a simple thing that says, as a user, I want to be able to do this. And the interactions between systems is only the business of the systems, is only the systems worry about, and the user doesn't care. Funny enough that I heard it from some people saying, oh, I as a user, I want to write, excuse me, I want to write the user story that says, forgive me, give me a break here. Okay, my apology. Some people say, I just want to state a simple user story that says, as a customer, I want to be able to cancel my order online, and I don't care what happens inside. Really? You don't care that the system you're trying to use communicates with the accounting system to issue the refund, and there is a possibility that this accounting system might be down, and the system you're trying to use have to react to the fact that the other system is down? This is what we do in use cases. So please, user story, you must be able to attach a use case to a user story when you need to. If the user story is simple enough, then yes, you don't need a use case. All right. Because user stories are brief, we must always be able to associate and attach documents and models and diagrams to the user story to provide more details. We need to make up for the lack of details in user stories by attaching a document or attaching, I mean, you can be attaching a spreadsheet. If the user story is about a report, creating a report, as a customer, I'd like to see a report on whatever. What does the report look like? What data should be in that report? That should be in, for example, an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document that would be attached. So user stories. I'm telling you all the best practices. If your tool that you are using for user stories does not allow you to do this, then it's useless. All right. Now, risks. When it comes to risks, a lot of people do not understand that. When we take a user story to implement it, there might be some risks in the course of the project that might hinder us from delivering that user story, whatever the risk is. And in an agile project using user stories, we seem to overlook those risks. Okay, we seem not to document them at all, and we get a surprise in the middle of the road that we cannot deliver this user story because whatever happened, because we were relying on a whatever third-party software or component that was supposed to acquire, but that component is no longer available, whatever it is. So those are what I refer to as project risk that relates to user stories. I can elaborate on this at another time, but the discussion, I mean, I can see I still have 5 more practices here, but I don't have much time to cover all of them. So user stories must have tasks associated with them. This is very interesting. When I speak with agile people, they say, we just grab a user story and we work on it. What is it? Are we just a group of people sitting around a table doing some sort of a sloppy job? A user story have tasks associated with it. Have the task of being reviewed and approved. Have the task of being designed. The task of being coded. The task of being tested. And even if it is all one person who's going to do it, we need to keep track of those tasks, because we need to keep track of the progress in each one of those tasks. All right? We don't want to just simply say the user story has been completed or not completed. My God. If the user story has so many tasks, can't we say what task has been completed, what not? By the way, I write so much about this stuff on LinkedIn, and every once in a while I get someone who's very agile. By the way, I practice agile, but I don't practice agile the way other people practice it. So other people get back to me on LinkedIn, and once I start to talk in this way, say, oh, you are not an agile person. The moment I start proposing some discipline, people accuse me of being not agile. The moment I start suggesting best practices, people say you're not agile. And I recall an individual on LinkedIn says, Magdi, you don't know how agile projects work. I sure do. I just don't agree with it. I don't agree that every member of the team grabs a user story to their liking and they start working on it. And at the end, he's going to report, did he finish it or he did not finish it? If we're going to scale agile to work with larger I mean, what we're doing here, what people are suggesting is okay if we have a project that has 5 people and it has, if we have sprint that has 3 or 4 user stories. I'm not talking about those projects. These are too simplistic projects for me. I am writing those best practices to help you scale agile to be used in all kinds of projects, from aviation to medical devices to whatever. All right. User stories must be traced to code. Some people say, well, we know where the code is. No, I don't. I want to be able to put my hand on a user story in the tool, and I want the tool to show me what code has been written to implement that user story. And I'd like a developer to be able to walk through the code to make sure it is doing what's supposed to do. This is the simplest traceability principle. And another traceability principle, that a user story must absolutely be traced to test cases. I want to be, and some of you might say, oh yeah, of course, we know that. That's important. If you know it is important, I am happy. If you're going to argue it, then please argue it with me. You want to be able to put your hand on a user story and says, where are the test cases we used to test that user story? Where are the positive test cases? Where are the negative test cases? And do we have enough coverage of that user story or not? That's very critical. And a tool must allow you to do this. Now, if you've been using user stories, some people use the concept of acceptance criteria to provide more details, okay, about the user story, which I'm grateful to that. In 2 weeks from now, from today, I'm going to be doing a webinar on acceptance criteria versus scenarios. I have been teaching scenarios to, to different projects, agile or non-agile, for over now 25 years. And people know the value of scenarios, even in agile projects. And because of that, I decided to do the webinar I'm doing in 2 weeks that compares acceptance criteria to scenarios and see how much detail. So all what I'm saying here, in addition to acceptance criteria that you might be using, user stories must also have scenarios. Okay, and scenarios are much, much more details than acceptance criteria. Every project, every company I went to teach them scenarios, and I looked at their acceptance criteria, and I asked them the question, says, would you replace your acceptance criteria with scenarios, or you want to continue to use your acceptance criteria? They say no. Scenarios are actually give a different dimension of details that we would like to keep along with the acceptance criteria. And some projects says, well, if we're going to use scenarios, we might as well not use acceptance criteria anymore. So again, this is not the webinar to talk about the difference between them, but if you are interested, join me in 2 weeks from today. Because of what I said in the beginning of the discussion, user stories are not good for quality requirements, for implementation details, for policies. Imagine when we deal with in the biomedical technology and biomedical engineering, there are so many regulations by the ISO and by FDA, and you need to phrase those somewhere, either as a document that's attached to the user story or as another user story. And that's why I'm suggesting that user stories must have different types, not only functional. When user stories were implemented and been practiced, as I said, they're all functional. But we understand not everything in the system is functional. There are so many things that are implementation constraints, policies, standards, regulations, and quality, and performance, and security, and safety. I mean, all the safety rules and all the safety requirements imposed by the FAA and the FDA and other international ISO standards. How are we going to phrase this in this very simplistic form of a user story? I'll show you all that in the next 17 minutes that I have. I'll show you this in Romana ALM. Romana ALM is a fully integrated application lifecycle manager. It's not your typical thing. It does everything you can imagine. The user stories and the requirements are here, but it does everything you need to do about test management. It has a component for document management. When I say component here, this tool is not a bunch of things put together. No, this tool is one tool that does everything, and you do only what you need to do, and you can ignore what you don't want to do. Remember when I said user stories must be collaboratively reviewed and approved? It's all right here in the collaboration center. The collaboration center will allow you to take a user story, put it out for review, document all the comments from people, will allow you to take the user story to the whole approval process. It allows you to decide on who's supposed to approve the user story, in what order. Romana ALM does everything that you need to do. Remember when I said a user story must have tasks and risks associated with it? This is all done here in the project management. Okay, and of course, everything is going to the Romana repository. It's one SQL Server database that holds all the information. Much simpler to use than any tool you've seen. Okay, of course, it does all the issue management thing. It does all the use cases. As I said, when I said a user story must have use cases associated with them when need to. Of course, it's there. So allow me, please, to spend the next 15 minutes or so with Romana. Let me close this. This is a project that's open. I'm going to close that. What you see in front of your screen is what we call the portfolio screen. This is what you get when you open Romana ALM for the first time. It shows you all the products you have, and within each project it shows you all the projects. You can see here I'm having Romana ALM as one of the products. Why? Because we use Romana ALM to manage the Romana ALM projects. Of course, if we believe in it as a powerful tool, then we must use it for our own business. All right, so here is a bunch of projects in Romana, and we just name, those are not releases, but we name the project based on what release that came out of that project. Although in the recent enhancement of Romana ALM, you can actually have a project that deliver features or user stories to multiple releases. So it's not the relationship between a project and release is not one-to-one anymore. So at any rate, so those are real projects, but they're a snapshot of the projects. We use them for demos. We use them to show our customers things. So they're mostly true data, but have been modified over time, but it's not all the features in release 10.3. So let me open that project. And when you open a project for the first time, you get to the project dashboard, which shows you certain things about your project. And this is customizable, totally customizable through the configure dashboard here. And you can decide on what charts you'd like to see, what reports you'd like to see, and so on. This is like a first glance you see about your projects. Now, let me go to user stories right here. So as you can see, user stories, change requests, test sets, documents, and the reports are here. So I'm going to go straight to user stories. If I click on that, it'll show me, as we said, I said user stories are here. There are different types of user stories. There are functional user stories, there are quality user stories, there are hardware requirements user stories. Someone said, what are you talking about? User stories are not about hardware requirements. Really? So how are you going to specify the requirements that have to do with the hardware? Where are you going to specify that? Because that's part of the system. When I say hardware here, I'm talking about a device. If I'm using this tool to help me with a medical device, for designing a medical device, that medical device, believe it or not, it has software, it has hardware, it has firmware, and all the requirements must be here. I have some implementation constraints. I have some requirements, some regulations, and those are totally dynamic. You can define anything you want. The only thing that's you start with is the functional and the quality, and you can add anything after that. Usability requirements, ISO standards. ISO standards require you that your products have certain usability requirements, okay? And a lot of other government acts require you to have certain requirements. Where are these going to be documented? Right here. So let me pull out the functional requirements. As I said, the first practice, user stories are represented in the form of hierarchy of details. This is a user story. For example, let's do this. Let's just expand this one here. Okay. As a user, I want to be able to, sorry for the typo. I mean, this is editing. To be able to configure attribute values for different project entities. So that's the high level one. That's the epic one. It consists of a number of sub-user stories. As user story, I want to be able to configure issue report attribute values. These are requirements. These are user stories within the Romana ALM. I'm sure you can realize it by now. Okay. So these are some of the features that are currently implemented in Romana ALM. Okay. As a user, I want to be able to configure requirement attribute values. So each one of those. So let's pick up one of those. You click on this one, you can see the details on the right. So let me now narrow this. Now, you might have noticed this. Some of these are phrased as user story and some are not. If you look here, for example, configure change request to attribute values. I just decided to leave this in this format, not in the user story format, to show you that you are free, or you should be always free, to use a user story format or a requirement format. Who cares? They're both equivalent. A requirement can have sub-requirements. A user story can have sub-user stories. If you don't feel, here, project backup, I left it as that. I could have phrased it as user story that says, as a project manager, I'd like to perform a project backup. So I just want to tell you that a tool should be flexible. If you want to, and whether you use a user story format or requirement format should be a process thing, not a tool thing. A tool should not restrict you. The process does. So you can tell everybody that we're going to be using user story format, and that's it. And that means that you're not going to see things like this. So let's now look at the details of the user story, because I only have about 9 minutes to show some of the things that I told you about. Okay. Here is a box for acceptance criteria. Okay, if you're using acceptance criteria, you use this box. And I'm just going to add some acceptance criteria very quick here. I'm just adding a couple of acceptance criteria. So here are my acceptance criteria, whatever they are. If your project uses acceptance criteria, I have not changed anything in that. However, as I said, in addition to acceptance criteria, a user story must have scenarios. If you click here, it shows you all the scenarios that have been defined for this user stories. My God, all these details are about the user stories. Where would we put them? I'm not going to get into all the details, but I'm going to tell you the developer and the tester who work with this user story felt that there are 32 scenarios that provide much more details about this user story. If we don't have scenarios, where are we going to put those? Let me close. I'm sorry to go quick. When I said use cases, here you go. By the way, the 3 yellow dots here tells me that there is something behind the button. Okay? Like for example here, there are no risks that have been defined for this user story. It happened that this user story does not have any risks associated with it. But there are tasks, and if I click here, it'll show me the rest of the task: development, testing by developer, final testing, test design. All these are tasks associated with the user story. And guess what? If you click on a task, it'll show you whom it was assigned to, and it will show you the progress and everything. I don't want to dive into that level of details yet, but a task is not simple thing that we put there. Here you go. So gives you task name, the task description, and other user stories that are associated with this task. User story group 1, group 2, group 3. So which means development does not only apply to this user story, but it applies to those other user stories. And the word the group here means that a group of user stories together, and so on. And you can see here the person who created that task is Jane Walsh. She created it in 2010. She never modified it, and so on. And it tells you here the estimated hours, the total actual hours, and the estimated cost, and so on. Everything about the task you can imagine. Okay? So let me close that. Move to something different. You remember when I said the user story must be collaboratively reviewed and approved? Right here. Of course, if you work in a simplistic project that you don't care for those, don't use them. But if I want to do this, so if I want to review this, look at that. Review this user story. If I click on this, I can I can do this. Please look at this user story. Give me your feedback by tomorrow morning. Very simple. Okay, I'm just gonna, so submit. Once I do that, guess what? All the team members are going to receive an email, and it tells me up here, Romana email notification reviewed for reviewing this user story was its scenarios are successfully sent or sent successfully. Everyone, if I open my Outlook right now, you'll see the email, but I don't want to get there. But the email goes to everyone. Of course, you might ask who gets the email. It's all provided here during, it's all in the collaboration center. Where is that? Oh, sorry. Come on. Here it is. In the collaboration center, you can manage collaboration groups. You can decide there who's supposed to receive emails about what. Okay. And then, so now people can review the user story online. They can provide their feedback. They can, so here, so I can ask people to just review the user story by itself. When we have scenarios for the user stories, I can tell them to review the user story and the scenarios. I can post my comment on the user story. So if I click on this, okay, I can add a comment here. I can say, and we ask people when they put out a comment, they put it using topics. By the way, it says topic 1, topic 2, topic 3 are for tests. Okay, but I can certainly create a topic that says whatever, that says interaction with whatever. Okay, so that's the topic, and I describe what my comment is, and I submit it. Okay, here you go. It's added there. Anyone who's going to look at those, they can see my comment or my question. Okay, and react to it. All the comments, all the reactions to comments, all the reviews are here. If I want to define what we call approval authorities, because again, as I said, you might be willing to say, you know, this user story needs to be approved, and you can say approved by who, approved by what date, and you can define who is supposed to review it. And if you have multiple people who are supposed to review it, you can decide if any of them can approve it, or all of them must approve it. And if all of them must approve it, you can even specify the order in which they must approve it. Then you say, for example, Magdi should approve it first, and only after Magdi approves it, then Joe can approve it. But Joe cannot approve it before Magdi. It goes into that level of details. All right, got 2 minutes left. Related user stories. If I click on this, it shows me the other user stories that are related to this user story. And I can add more if I wanted to. If I feel like this user story relates to another user, to a third user story, I can add that. The history here is there. So when a user story changes, it tells me here. Okay. The title of the user story has been changed from this to this on that date by this person. Very simple. You got to have that. If user stories are going to change over time, we need to keep track of that. I think I better use the time to look at any questions you might have. Let me see here. Questions. All right, let me pull this out. I'm going to try to. Lydia says traceability is a key when it changes are requested to the functionality being outlined from the user story. Thank you, Lydia. Lydia has provided a number of comments, but she has a question that says, how can we obtain the slide deck? Okay. This whole presentation is going to be recorded and available. I don't know if we make the actual electronic copy of the slide deck available. But as I said, I will be publishing an article on LinkedIn very soon, and you'll have the same contents there. We just don't like to give the slides because people use them to present them, and it loses context and it loses some credibility. People make changes to the slides. My apology for that. People make changes to slides and they present them, then suddenly my ideas are presented not as is. If we trusted that people are gonna take the slides, present them as is, we would have released them. My apology, Christina, for the problem in the sound. No one else seemed to have a problem with the sound. Okay, is this a question or a comment? I have two questions to evaluate how Romana ALM can add value to our process. Okay, just want to see who asked the question, because I don't think I want to take the time now how about if we answer your questions, because this is, I'm going to say those are specific questions about Romana for you to evaluate Romana if you would like to see if it improves your process. You have two big questions. Allow me please to send you, have someone send you an email with answers to the two questions. I just don't want to use the time here to seem like I am trying to pitch Romana ALM for sale. Are there training overhead to write use cases as per Romana system? No, Romana uses the same discipline of use cases that's known out in the industry. Okay, so Romana itself does not teach you how to write use cases, but it coaches you through the process. So you really need to learn about use cases outside, and we have courses on how to write effective use cases. So you learn that first and use a tool. Normally, you should never rely on a tool that teach you a discipline, but rather learn the discipline your own or the process in your own. So use cases are taught separately, but then you use the tool to do that. Another question. Okay. Lydia is asking if we can review slide number 7. Let me do that. And okay, very quick here, and that's the last question. Lydia, go ahead. I'm going to put the slide in front of us here. Oops. Where is it? Right here. Slide number 7. I'm going to close this window quick. I know I'm 3 minutes beyond my time. Slide number 7 is right here. And in this one, I said, user stories must exist in a hierarchy of details. As I showed you, user stories, sub-user stories, sub-user stories, and there is no limit to how deep you can go with the hierarchy. And number 2 is talking about changes to user story over time, and we must keep track of the changes. We must keep track. I didn't show you the versions, by the way. The versions are there. So I showed you the history of the change, that someone had changed the user story. I did not show you the change request. I did not show you the versions. When a user story is changed, we create another version of the user story. And I spoke about, I showed you how we can collaboratively review and approve a user story. Very quick here. So this was a button for reviewing the user story. Here is the button to approve it, and I described how the process is used. The versions are here. This user story happened. It doesn't have any versions because there is no yellow dots here, but let me see if there is another user story that has versions. You would see it here. Those are all version 1. This user story here, version 1, version 2. As you can see, it is the same user story. And you click on this, you see the details of version 1. You click on this, you see the details of version 2. And the change requests are here. You attach a change request to a user story when you would like to make a major change to the user story. So if I were to look at this, this one, we should see the change request there. So version 1 existed. Version 1 existed, and someone decided to make a change, a major change to version 1. So he submitted a change request here, and that's a change request. And based on that change request, version 2 was created. All right. I think I should close now. Let me look at questions the last minute here, the last time. All right, thanks to everyone. My apology to take 5 minutes beyond my time. Remember to go to Romana ALM website. It is available for you to try for free for 60 days. If you decide to, by the way, Romana ALM has been recognized last year as the most innovative ALM solution. Because of all the things I'm talking about. Romana also covers everything you need to do with medical devices. But here are all the components, and you can try it for free for 60 days for 3 people. So that you can, we want you to have a real project that you can use. And look at the prices of Romana ALM. If you just take the user story, the requirement, the change management, so it's $15 per user per month. You can take the whole thing for $50 per user per month. Okay, so these are the prices, and that is if you're going to be subscribing to in the cloud. If you're going to be hosting it, it's going to be even cheaper. Here are the packages. So yes, if you're going to be hosting it in your own environment, it's $10 per user per month. Plus, of course, the annual technical support. But if you want to use our own cloud and you want to just subscribe on a subscription basis, you can do this. And you can do it for as little as 3 months. You don't have to take a full year, 3 months. And you can take as little as 5 users. You're talking about here $75 a month for 5 users, for 3 months. Couple $100, you can get Romana for 3 months for 5 users. You can use it in a real project and see if it helps you or not. All right. Sorry for the sales pitch, but I needed to tell you this because otherwise my marketing guys are not going to be happy with me. All right. Thank you very much for your time again. Hope to see you in the next webinar in 2 weeks from now. Eric, I am done. Sorry to take 7 minutes about my time.
Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by Romana Software, the leaders in the leader in application lifecycle management technology. For more information on how Romana Software can help you or your organization, please visit romanasoftware.com. Again, be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Acceptance Criteria versus Scenarios, Writing Better User Stories with Romana ALM by Dr. Magdi Hanna on June 1st from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to romanasoftware.com. You can follow Romana Software on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about Romana news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thanks again, Dr. Hanna.
Thank you.